articulates a time in Israel's history after David, through a series of kings' life before the exile. And we picked this book in particular because it's a place where many Christians get stuck in the Bible. It's a place where suddenly Israel is referred to as Israel, but part of Israel is not referred to as Israel. Israel is referred to as Judah. It's also an overlap with many different books. And so it's a confusing part of the Bible for many people. And we've been trusting that we've been able to help us make sense of this book. And today, I think, as we reach the tail end, I'm hoping that in some ways a bunch of threads are going to come together for us and bring clarity. And so last week we looked at the sin of Jeroboam. The sin of Jeroboam, Jeroboam the first, which was prolific throughout Israel. When I say Israel, I mean the northern kingdom. I'm going to refer to them as Samaria the rest of the day. The sin of Jeroboam was prolific throughout Samaria. The sin of Jeroboam, what was it? It was idolatry. What is idolatry? Idolatry is taking any created thing and elevating it above the Creator and subjugating God or relegating God to secondary in our lives. The human heart tends to worship created things over the Creator. And this is what Jeroboam was guilty of, but not just Jeroboam. We saw time after time, king after king, and we'll see it again. The sin of Jeroboam, this idolatry. Where are we in the book of Kings? Well, at this stage, the great prophets Elijah and Elisha have died, but the kings remain resolute in their idolatry. They are determined to persist in their idolatry and their evil. And today we're going to see just how bad things can get when we refuse to do away with our rebellion and refuse to come back to God. Today, we're going to get a bonus look at both kingdoms side by side. First, the northern kingdom, Samaria, and then the southern kingdom, Judah, Jerusalem, I refer to as. Making sense? At times, it's going to be, as we see just how bad it gets, disturbing as well. This is evil that has burst its bounds. This is what happens when a people are determined to reject God and charge down a path. And so, we will see in the first half of this message, what follows is a rapid-fire look at the consequences of hearts divided from God. Not solely focused on God, but divided, and sin is left to kind of reign rampant in life. So we're 2 Kings chapter 15. If you've got your Bible, follow along. There's quite a lot of scripture reading we're going to do, and I'm going to be doing it from the NLT, the New Living Translation. It's a brilliant translation for large chunks of scripture that I love to read from. And so, 2 Kings chapter 15. Give you a second to find your way there. We'll also follow along on the screen. Zechariah, son of Jeroboam II, began to rule over Israel. This is the northern kingdom now. We're up in the north. In the 38th year of the king Uzziah's reign in Judah, he reigned in Samaria 6 months. Zechariah did what was evil in the Lord's sight, and as did his ancestors. He refused to turn from the sins that Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, had led Israel to commit. We heard about that last week. Then Shallum, the son of Jabesh, conspired against Zechariah and assassinated him in public. And then he became the next king. The rest of Zechariah's reign are recorded in the history of the kings of Israel. So the Lord's message to Jehu came true. Your descendants will be kings of Israel down to the 4th generation. Zechariah is become the next king of Israel. And how long does his reign last? A whopping 6 months. How long was his father before him king for? 41 years. 6 months. Suddenly, it's as if the judgment of God is sped up, and suddenly it's coming. This kind of open carnality. He's assassinated in the public square. It's an open carnality where evil has spilt its bounds. The kings have been resolute. They have refused to come back to God after many warnings. They've rejected God, and you can start to see as chaos takes over in the nation. It's as if judgment has been held back, and suddenly they're handed over to the very thing they've been chasing for, handed over to their own desires. And it's very quick. Now Shallum, the next king, son of Jabesh, began to rule over Israel in the 39th year of King Uzziah's reign in Judah. How long did he reign? Shallum reigned in Samaria for 1 month. Then Menahem, the son of Gadi, went to Samaria from Tirzah and assassinated him, and he became the next king. I mean, it's starting to sound like the Wild West, eh? You want to be king, just go and take the other king out, and then you can have a turn to be king. We're going to all have a turn to be king. The rest of the events of Shallum's reign, including this conspiracy, are they recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Israel. I mean, if you thought 6 months was quick, talk about 41 years, 6 months, 1 month. These people have been handed over to their own sinfulness. They've been resolute. And so in so doing, the nation has become like the Wild West. It's as if God has said, if you really, really have to walk away from me, if you are dead set and refuse to come back, then here it is. This is what you're after. And so the spiral of murder and assassination and really chaos begins to rule in the nation. Verse 16, at that time, Menahem destroyed the town of Tapua. This is where it gets horrific. And all the surviving countryside as far as Tirzah. This is his own countryside. This is his own land. Because his citizens refused to surrender the town. He killed the entire population and ripped open a pregnant woman. It's awful. Menahem, son of Gadi, began to rule over Israel the 39th year of King Uzziah's reign in Judah. And he reigned in Samaria for 10 years, but Menahem did what was evil in the Lord's sight. During his entire reign, he refused to turn from the sins. You get the idea? The language is dead set on rebelling against God. During his entire reign, he refused to turn from the sins that Jeroboam, son of Nebat, had led Israel to commit. This is evil without boundaries, spilling over, and they're doing it to themselves. It's a set in rebellion, resolutely held against God. And then King Tiglath-Pileser, we're going to call him TP for obvious reasons as this goes on, right? The king of Assyria, TP, invaded the land. It's not long before things go further pear-shaped. And the king of Assyria, the mighty power of the day, invades the land. But Menahem paid him 37 tons of silver to gain his support in tightening the grip of royal power. Where did the money come from? Menahem extorted the money from the rich people of Israel, demanding that each of them pay 50 pieces of silver to the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria turned from attacking Israel and did not stay in the land. The rest of the events of Menahem's reign and everything that he did, are they not recorded in the book, The History of the Kings of Israel? When Menahem died, his son Pekahiah became king. It's very clear that God's judgment is beginning to get more and more intense in Israel this time, in the form of Assyria coming in. Now, Menahem delays this by taking wealth from his own people and now paying off the Assyrians for a while. But in effect, what he does is he concedes the independence of the nation. He subjugates himself to these Assyrians. And you get the feeling that he's just buying time, that this judgment is coming. The next king, Pekahiah, he lasts 2 years. I'm not going to read that section. He lost 2 years. He also did evil in the sight of the Lord. He also didn't turn from the sins of Jeroboam. And it's not long before he too was assassinated as well. It gets very boring. It gets very predictable. And I think the author has written this in such a way as to say, if you remain resolute in walking away from God, your life becomes as boring and predictable as those who were before you. Rinse and repeat, the same old, until Pekah, who assassinated Pekahiah, the son of Ramaliah, began to rule over Israel in the 52nd year of King Uzziah's reign in Judah. He reigned in Samaria for 20 years, but Pekah did what was evil in the Lord's sight. He refused to turn from the sins that Jeroboam, son of Nebat, led Israel to commit. During Pekah's reign, King Tb of Assyria attacked Israel again. But now we see it fully released. He captured the towns of Lijon, of Abel, Beth Makkah, of Janoah, of Kadesh, of Hazor. He also conquered the regions of Gilead and Galilee and all of Naphtali. And he took people to Assyria as captives. This is the start of the exile. This land that was once given to Israel is now being chopped off piece by piece, city by city, region by region, and people are carried off as slaves to the ruling power of the day. Then Hoshea, the son of Elah, conspired against Pekah and assassinated him. And he began to rule over Israel the 20th year of Jotham, son of Uzziah. And the rest of the events of Pekah's reign and everything that he did are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Israel. It's rinse and repeat. Same old story, same old story. Assyria comes back now to finish what they began. Israel is now in the throes, if you will, of exile. Cities, regions are being taken over. People are being carried off as slaves. The exile is beginning. The exodus that began with Moses all those years ago is now being undone. And it's at the stage of the book of Kings where we actually get to try and take in the mega themes that have been present for the whole. And so we've got a really cool slide, if we're able to stick that up, Robin. It's a slide where like lots of that's the one. He didn't design this for us. Come on. This is way too high grade for me to have designed this one. You guys have to see that slide over here. Sort of. I'm going to move back a little bit. Sorry, you guys watching on, well. Well, I've got something, I'll stop. Where were we? What we see here in this slide is it kind of represents the journey, right? What started out in the book of Exodus. Israel was slaves. They were dominated by Egypt, and God heard their cries, and He came down to rescue them. And He brought a rescuer, a mighty prophet named Moses, and Moses delivers them, and He leads them out, and He leads them out of slavery into the desert where they come into covenant relationship with God. And God says to them, you will be my God, and I will be your people. And this people who were slaves are led into Exodus. And they go and they're brought into the promised land. And in the promised land, the gods of the day, the empires and their evil gods, and you'll hear more about these Canaanite pagan gods in a second, are driven out of the land, and God's people are established in the land, and they're given kings. And the heart of this is David, and the book of Kings opens, almost finishing off, if you will, the Exodus, with this great King Solomon. And Solomon leads Israel to this kind of restored Eden, if you will. The early chapters of Kings are dripping references to Eden. There's the wisdom and the life and the flourishing that happens under this King Solomon, who is exclusively devoted to God. It's this glory time of God's kingdom is being established under Solomon, who is exclusively devoted to God. The early chapters dripping with references to Eden. It's almost as if the culmination of the Exodus is the re-establishment of Eden in the world. And we see this because the climax of the book of Kings is the temple being built according to God's specific design. And it's being commissioned and dedicated, and the presence of God comes in the midst of the people of God. It's very Edenic, the presence of God being restored in the midst of the nation. And then just after that, we see again another reference to the purpose of Eden as the Queen of Sheba comes and she brings with herself entourages to come and to learn from the ways and the wisdom. This is 1 Kings 11. They learn from God's people. Israel is being a light to the nations. Will fill the earth with the image of God. It's a reference to Eden in some ways as well. And so Eden is, we see this at the presence of God in the midst of the people, the light that's going out to the nations. But the more successful Solomon becomes, and the greater he becomes, the more his heart is divided as well. And eventually Solomon's heart is divided. As much as these nations are coming to learn God's wisdom, I wish the book had stopped here. Solomon's heart is split. By the end of Solomon's life, he's no longer worshipping God in exclusivity. He's worshipping the idols of money and sex and power. Money and gold, sex and hundreds of foreign wives, and power has gone to his head. And his heart is divided, and so with Solomon's heart that's divided, so too the nation is divided. And so for the first time, this unified nation is broken into two. The northern kingdom, we can call them Samaria, the capital city. The southern kingdom, Judah, Jerusalem, the capital city, is divided. And then you get this string of separate kings that go. And really, there's the northern kingdom, Israel, Samaria, the southern kingdom, Judah, the string of kings. And much of the book focuses on the northern kingdom, Samaria, where there's this tension of this battle between these evil kings, and God sends these great prophets to call them home, Elijah and Elisha. And each of these kings is kind of evaluated according to this refrain of, did they do evil or good in the Lord's sight? And did they get rid of the idolatry and oppose, or did they encourage idolatry? And Israel, horribly, out of 20 kings after this division that happens, has 0 out of 20 score for their kings. One king more evil than the next. And what we start to see here is this idolatry, the sins of Jeroboam. One by one king picks up after the next, one king picks up after the next. And eventually this kind of deliberate dead set rebellion against God is undoing this Eden eventually. You start to see that in what happens in the temple, and you start to see it in the conflict that's both internal and external with other nations happening in the nation of Israel. You see the Canaanite gods that were driven out as part of the Exodus and the entrance into the promised land are now brought back by Israel's kings. And this destruction that happens throughout because of that. So we see this all throughout the journey through the book of Kings. So far we've been tracking mostly with the northern kingdom the last few weeks. But this split happens and Israel scored an incredible 0 out of 20 for their kings. As one evil king hands over the baton to another more evil than him, and another legacy just begins to go. And eventually you get to where we are today. And it's really a long list of tragedy. And you see today how it's sped up, that little vortex there at the bottom. You can imagine the situation. Israel has been one king after the next, circling the grave. Wide circles first. God sends the prophet to warn them. Oh, come back. God sends Elijah. Didn't listen to Elijah. God sends Elisha. And what happens is, eventually, as you remain resolute and resolute and resolute to do that, eventually the circle gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And we have one king lasting 6 months before another one takes him out and lasts a month. And it's just this carnage as they're handed over to this kind of evil that they're dead set on following. And it's all spiraled out of control. And that's where we are. Remember, the book of Kings answering the question, how did we get from the heights of King David to the depths of exile? And the answer is divided hearts. The answer is rebellion against God. And Paul writes about this in his letter to Rome. We see this echoed in the New Testament. Paul so beautifully sums up what we see taking place in this kingdom of Israel. Romans 1, verse 21 through to 25. Yes, they knew God, but they wouldn't worship him as God or give him thanks. They began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. And as a result, their minds became dark and confused. Claiming to be wise, they instead became utter fools. And instead of worshipping the glorious, ever-living God, they worshipped idols made to look like mere people, birds, animals, and reptiles. It's idolatry. It's imagery of God. So God abandoned them to do whatever shameful things their hearts desired. And that's what we see in these chapters we read. This is God. If you really want this, I've warned you, I've spoken enough times, if you really want this, here it is. And as a result, they did vile and degrading things with each other's bodies. They traded the truth about God for a lie. So they worshipped and served things God created instead of the Creator himself, who is worthy of eternal praise. The big idea today is divided hearts and divided worship lead to misery and even destruction. Divided hearts happen in Solomon, king after king. Divided worship lead to misery and even destruction. We've been focused largely on the northern kingdom of Samaria today. Now I want us to see how this is mirrored in the southern kingdom as well, as we're coming into land this morning as well. The northern kingdom scored a whopping 0 out of 20 for their kings. How many in the southern kingdom? Well, they did a little bit better, about 8 out of 20. But as we start to see toward the end, things get as bad in the south as they were in the north. And now we meet King Ahaz. King Ahaz is something else. So you ready? Chapter 16 of 2 Kings. Chapter 16. Ahaz, the son of Jotham, began to reign over Judah in the 17th year of King Pekah's reign. I love the way you see these same names and you see the overlap. And just now, we're going to see another book of the Old Testament where God was at work through the prophet Isaiah to the southern kingdom at the same time. All of these books work together. Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 16 years. He did not do what was pleasing in the sight of the Lord, his God, as his ancestor David had done. Instead, he followed the example of the kings of Israel, we just heard out of that verse, even sacrificing his own son in the fire. This is the Canaanite practice. As those Canaanite gods had been driven out earlier, now they've been brought back in. And this was the practice of the Canaanite gods. In this way, he followed the detestable practices of the pagan nations the Lord had driven out from the land ahead of the Israelites. He offered sacrifices and burnt incense in the pagan shrines and on the hills and under every green tree. A little whisper of Eden there. Except in Eden, where God is not at the center nor his presence, but other gods have been put at the center. Now remember, this is written generations after Israel. Generations after the people that lived there. In order that God's people would look back and learn. There's a sense of prophetic history, a lens to helping future generations like us learn from this. The early chapters of the book of Kings, I told you, were full of references to Eden, dripping of this Eden that's being restored. And now we start to see idols under every tree. It's echoing Eden again, but it's an undoing of Eden. It's an undoing of what's been done here. It's a reversal. It's as if through this lineage of kings, the Exodus has been undone. The Canaanite gods that were vanquished have now been reinstated by the very king himself. Now God's people are worshipping the very same gods that God drove out earlier. And even these detestable practices that were associated with it. And it's not long, obviously, before things go pear-shaped. We read in verse 5, then King Rezin of Aram and King Pekah of Israel, their own brother nation that split off, King Pekah, we just read about him. He and Rezin form a little unholy alliance, and they come knocking to attack Jerusalem, and they besieged Ahaz, but they could not conquer him. Now this is really cool, where we start to see other books of the Bible reference this event that's taking place. There was a prophet that was speaking to Judah at this time. It was Isaiah. So if you open the book of Isaiah to Isaiah chapter 7, you see God's attempted intervention into Judah. And we read in Isaiah chapter 7, then the Lord said to Isaiah, go and meet King Ahaz. Tell him to stop worrying. Tell him that he doesn't need to fear the fierce anger of those two burned out members, King Rezin of Syria and Pekah, son of Remaliah. This is what the sovereign Lord says. This invasion will never happen. It will never take place. For Syria is no stronger than its capital, Damascus, and Damascus no stronger than its king Rezin. As for Israel, within 65 years it will be crushed and completely destroyed. Israel is no stronger than its capital, Samaria, and Samaria no stronger than its king Pekah, son of Remaliah. Unless your faith is firm, I cannot make you stand firm. Now, Ahaz has got a decision. He's under the pump. So the two kingdoms have formed this unholy alliance. They've come at him. They've besieged him. God has offered him a lifeline. He said, put your trust in me. What's he going to do? Verse 7. King Ahaz sent messages to King TP of Assyria with this message. I am your servant, your vassal. I'm your son. Come up and rescue me from the attacking armies of Aram and Israel. Instead of taking refuge in God, who intervened and spoke to him throughout life, he makes a deal with the strong nation around the corner. Egypt, almost like Israel with Egypt, so to speak. Then Ahaz took the silver and the gold from the temple of the Lord and the palace treasury and sent it as a payment to the Assyrian king. He goes to God's temple, takes a bunch of the valuable stuff that was God's, and he gave it to King TP. So the king of Assyria attacked the Aramean capital of Damascus and led its population away as captives, resetting them in Kir, and he also killed King Rezin. Ahaz robbed God's temple to pay his new subscription fees to his new savior, the Assyrian king TP. It's a complete slap in the face to the Lord. It's just said to him, trust me. He said, I can't trust you, I'm going to make another plan, illegitimate plan. But Ahaz goes further. King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet King TP of Assyria. While he was there, he took special note of the altar. That's a nice altar, he thought to himself. Maybe we can upgrade God's design for an altar. Then he sent a model of the altar to Uriah the priest along with this design in full detail. Uriah followed the king's instructions and built the altar just like it. And it was ready before the king returned from Damascus. And when the king returned, he inspected the altar and made offerings on it. This is a key little phrase here. Then King Ahaz removed the old bronze altar, you know, the one that God inspired, from its place at the front of the Lord's temple, between the entrance and the new one. and placed it on the north side of the altar. He told Uriah the priest, use the new altar for the morning sacrifices of burnt offering and evening grain, and the king's burnt offering and the grain offering and the burnt offering. You get the idea. Verse 17. And the king removed the side panels of the basins from the portable water pots. He also removed the great bronze basin that was called the sea from the backs of the bronze oxen and placed it at the stone pavement. He took this piece that God had inspired in his temple when he decided this is how you'll worship me. And he took it apart and he dumped it on the pavement. In deference to the king of Assyria, he also removed the canopy that had been constructed inside the palace for use on the Sabbath day, as well as the king's outer entrance to the temple building. The rest of King Ahaz's reign, you get the idea. It's out with the old, God, Yahweh, and in with the new, King Tipi of Assyria. Effectively, he's devoted himself to King Tipi of Assyria. God had given him a lifetime and he turned his back on God. And he begins dismantling the Lord's temple, which God had been so specific. If you think back to, I think, our 4th or 5th week of the series through Kings, God gave such specific instructions as to the building of the temple. And now, King Ahaz is dismantling this thing as he brazenly takes things out and he moves new things in. He's rearranging the temple, and it wasn't just a temporary shift. This was like a kind of all-out, I'm going all-in devotion to the Assyrian king. He gets his priests to make a new altar. All of this undoing God's very specific design of this temple. And what we forget here is that God had designed this temple because this is how he wanted to be worshipped. This is how he wanted to be at the center of his people. And he just chops and changes. At the heart of the relationship between God and his people is covenant. Covenant that says, I will be your God and you will be my people. This is a relationship of exclusivity. And he's just brazenly changing the terms. As is effectively, he's taken his wife's perfume in order to give it to his own mistress. It's not just idolatry replacing God and dethroning him, but it's adultery as well, in that the exclusivity of the relationship has just been flagrantly disobeyed. Judah has left the Lord in favor of a new sugar daddy. And this renovation of the temple to the taste of the new sugar daddy kind of reflects this very heart. And what we see here is in all of this, it's a loss of the distinction of who God's people were created to be. They were meant to be God's people in his image as a light to the nations. And now their divided hearts and their resolute rejection of God, they've lost all the distinctives. That little reference to that great big basin called the sea that sat on top of the bronze altar. This was the sea that was meant to represent the nations, the Gentiles. In a sense, the people of God in this temple were holding up the nations to God, almost in prayer to say, God, we want to be a light to the nations. You've called us to reach them. Just picked it up and dumped it on the pavement. They've lost their sense of call. Instead of influencing the nations like Sheba, coming to learn how to live in the ways of God, now they have been influenced by the nations. They've become like the ones they were sent to reach. He's inventing his own way of worshiping the Lord. He's created his own religion with a little bit of Yahweh and a lot of King Tipi and the Syrian God. It's like Judah's version of the sin of Jeroboam. It's worshiping God on his own terms and his own preferences, and God wants this temple being dissected and dismantled and shaped into the image of another God. That's what's happening. It's a terrible place in the history of God's people, and it leads them to exile. The undoing of the Exodus in the form of exile. How does this apply to our lives today as we're coming into ordaining? Well, one of the things that the book of Kings teaches us is that when kingdoms clash, when cultures, our church, Common Ground South Bend, we are a little kingdom in this world. We are a culture. When kingdoms clash in our world, there is the potential to lose your identity. There is the danger of conformity. There is the pressure of one kingdom exerting itself on another, and the potential of hearts to be divided, and for this kingdom to lose its identity, to give yourself over to the very culture that you're trying to renew and to change. Every kingdom in every age has its own values and culture and practices and its own gods behind them. We've seen in our generation, I put to you, an incredible shift. In the last 20 years, our world has changed so much when it comes to its values and ideals and its practices. Modern culture has had such a shift in its values around the ideas of marriage, gender, sexuality, debt, Sabbath, worship, individualism. All of these things have radically shifted in the last 20 years ago. It's happened subtly at times through TV shows that we watch and entertainment and social media. It's happened blatantly as well and overtly as well at times. But in all of these things, our culture's gods and their agendas are being pushed forward. And you and I, as Christ followers, called to be light and to renew the culture, just like Israel were, face the same pressure to conform, to have your heart divided, diluted, and to lose what is distinctive to us. Our church is called to be light in a world that's lost its bearings. And the only way to be light is to reserve exclusivity in worship to God. To protect our worship of Him. Jesus said it so beautifully in Matthew chapter 6, verse 23. No one can serve two masters, for you will hate one, and you will love the other. You will be devoted to one, and you will despise the other. Guys, it's not a complicated message, but yet we've seen it played out throughout history, throughout the book of Kings. Our hearts get divided. The longer we go, the further we end up. And destruction and misery is the result. It's helpful as for us as believers to examine, how's your heart? How's your exclusivity before God? Is Christ still number one in your heart? Or have created things, money, career, sex, family, power, all these things? We're going to take that in a second. We're going to move toward the communion table, but I want us to focus as individuals. Christ has come in order that we can follow Him in exclusivity. He invites us to a followership. It is a kingdom of light. Jesus has come He has brought the kingdom of God near again. He has put us into His kingdom in order to be light to the nations or the community around us. But the critical thing that we have to take in light of today's message is, are our hearts like Solomon's being slowly divided, or are our hearts united around Christ, our one and only King? So I'm going to give you a second to think about that as we move toward the communion table, and then I want to lead us in a prayer response. Can I ask, as we move toward the communion table, that we exit the rows from the outside and we enter the rows again from the inside of the aisle? Does that make sense? So we're going to do